What does the media mediate? Facts or fiction? The media we like, share, and subscribe to mediates. Values. The values we see central to our life stories, which we call meaning. The facts in themselves carry no value. It is the framing of the facts which gives them a particular meaning. This is nowhere more apparent than in journalism. The 5 W's, or the 5 essential journalist questions, who, what, where, when, and why, serve not only to inform us of the event, but to interpret it. The moment we ask the question why, we find ourselves on the threshold of storytelling. We can add to this more than one question. What now? It is the questions of hidden motivations, meaning behind chaotic past events and the provision of the future that are primary goal of stories.
I want to go home, but I can't find my way.
Naturally, that's because you have no way.
Our dreams were the first primordial storytelling machines. Stories, like dreams, try to integrate our incoherent and tumultuous experiences by organizing various disparate images. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung suggested that dreams are doing the work of integrating our conscious and unconscious lives. He called this the process of individuation. However, there's a certain appeal to images that captivates our being. A total identification with an image is a type of blindness, as we are too close to tell the difference to recognize the world beyond its framework. The example of Jungian psychoanalysis perfectly reveals this kind of blindness, whereby the patient unconsciously identifies with only one archetype, not being able to differentiate, step out of this pattern, and see beyond its limits. Only one integral image of the patient's consciousness represents and substitutes the whole of reality. A man ceases to be a puppet of that story and becomes an individual when he frees himself from one persona and begins to freely take a different archetypal mask in relation to different contexts. In other words, he becomes aware of the writing in which he wrote his destiny. He becomes literate and thus able to write the rest of his own free will.
Please, listen. I've got 1 or 2 things to say. Tell us both of them. Look, you've got it all wrong. You don't need to follow me. You don't need to follow anybody. You've got to think for yourselves. You're all individuals. Yes, we're all individuals. You're all different. Yes, we are all different. I'm not. Shh.
From the Greek word eidolon, eidos, meaning form, shape, we come to the Latin equivalent, eidolum, or image. Idolatry can thus be understood as the worshipping of images. Long before we got to entertain our minds with new media, images permeated our imagination through stories. An idol is the distributor of truth and values. It is something that forms, frames, and mediates certain values. And we want values to be mediated.
Surely those people will step forward, given fresh source material, and do something. No, it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. In fact, people write about things in general, if it's not part of their career, because they want to display their values to their peers who are already in the same group. Actually, they don't give a fuck about the material. That's the reality.
In a book by H. Porter Abbott called The Cambridge Introduction to Narrative, Abbott talked about master plots as stories saturated through the time with collective values. We seem to connect our thinking about life, and particularly about our own lives, to a number of master plots that we may or may not be fully aware of. to the extent that our values and identity are linked to a masterplot. That masterplot can have strong rhetorical impact. We tend to give credibility to narratives that are structured by it. Much of the power of these particular masterplots, as with so many, is their moral force. They create an image of the world in which good and evil are clearly identifiable, and in which blame can fall squarely on one party or another. And this division between good and evil, friends and foe, is where we all call upon our tribes, uniting against the common enemy. The enemy being bearers of different value systems.
Bring her forward.
I'm not a witch, I'm not a witch.
But you are dressed as one.
They dressed me up like this. And this isn't my nose, it's a false one.
Well,
Well, we did do the nose.
the nose?
And the hat. But she's a witch!
As many have pointed out, most notably Mircea Eliade, masks play a big role in the rites of passage in many cultures. They are in fact a necessary part of the process of individuation. However shocking this may sound, it is the wearing of no mask that induces anxiety and the fear of the unknown. The face gives us a clear identity, making us either a friend or foe, good or bad. But fear arises when we meet the unintelligible, unrecognizable, and absolutely alien face of the other. As Abbott put it, it may eventually turn out that an interpretation of the narrative stands or falls on how we fill this gap. In short, external causes are usually easy to spot. It is the causative chemistry inside that is hard to figure. We cannot see inside character. We must infer. This is the very threshold of narrative. The moment we start interpreting the invisible internal cause behind external events, we engage in storytelling. We'll look into a contemporary example. The stories of one's anonymous organization that provoked some of the biggest controversies of our time, the WikiLeaks. We assume that the face of the truth we are looking for is hidden somewhere behind the mask, and that we need to unmask this truth in order to show it to the world. This is precisely a Platonic fallacy, a direct perception of the truth. Face to face, we require a mask. The basic problem, then, is not to get to the truth, but to present it. Mendax was Assange's original hacker pseudonym, which is the Latin term for noble liar. This raises the question of why someone who fights for the truth to come out presents himself as a liar. Could it be that the truth can only be delivered as a well-intentioned lie? When we asked if WikiLeaks needs a face, Assange replied,
WikiLeaks needs a face.
Yeah, the public demands that it has a face, and actually we'd much sort of prefer, I'd prefer if it didn't have to have a face. And we tried to do that for a while, and people just, the demand was sort of so great, people just started inventing faces.
However, Assange claims that the public demanded the face of the organization and, in the absence of the person, began to fill that gap on its own. In order to explain the significance of the organization, the public begins to invent faces on its own. These faces are kinds of narratives with which the public encircles, creates an identity, an effort to shed the light on the new phenomenon from within. It tries to expose the meaning. It is about creating a persona which represents and combines information into one ideological position. In other words, it's about creating a brand. For the public eye, WikiLeaks distributes classified information just as a brand would market its products. However cynical or depressing this may sound to some, it is undeniably one of the pressing challenges we face today. We'll take a look at some examples, starting with the well-known biblical story of David and Goliath. What we have here is a story of a small group of men hacking into a system of a much bigger power structure. By referring to a master plot that underlines the story, we confirm its credibility. As Polita and Callahan, authors of the paper Deep Stories, Nostalgia Narratives, and Fake News, wrote, in reality, however, we glean a story's point by referencing to stories we have heard before. We hear a story of a little guy going up against a big guy, and we recognize them as David and Goliath. We hope David will win, and if he does, we take the message that cleverness will triumph over brute force. Story's persuasive power lies in the ability to call up other compelling stories. Abbott argues that a story is appealing because it carries with it an enormous emotional charge. One man versus a big corporation, a small group of vigilantes against a powerful system. Here we are compelled to reference another story, that of Robin Hood, the one taking from the rich, the corrupt, and the powerful, and feeding the poor, calling out for a fair distribution of information, fighting for freedom and democracy. However, this story does not give us any information on the events that took place. It is a frame that binds selected events in such a way so as to indicate who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, making it easier for us to swallow the bitter pill. In the face of doubt, distress, uncertainty, we have no time to assemble and evaluate raw information, as we only have one question: who do we trust? How do I identify a friend, an enemy, a threat?
Well, some go this way, some go that way. But as for me, myself, personally, I prefer the shortcut.
Oh!
But there are more nuanced stories that do not depict such simple conflicts, but stories nonetheless. One of such being the telling of the events in Gibney's documentary, The Story of WikiLeaks.
This is a man who's elusive, he's always flying around the place, he doesn't have any roots, and he's got a number of kids. There might be some sort of primary impulse in him to want to just reproduce, to want to have some sort of bedrock in his life. This is the ultimate digital man, and actually you can't just live in a digital world.
Instead of being informed on the details and circumstances of the charge, we are offered the story of a boy with no roots, no firm ground to stand on, who moved constantly in his youth, and who is now trying to ground himself in the form of a primal need, instinctively, the only way he can, since he is otherwise a phantom, a digital man. In this story, we can recognize the narrative of the Flying Dutchman, who is cursed to sail the open sea and never reach the shore. A man who tries in vain to get in touch with the land and living and transfer knowledge from the afterlife. A hacker is no longer a person who has a good command of technology and breaks through security systems, but someone who sails through the digital afterlife, someone who is eternally lost to this world, someone who longs for the coast.
For too long I've been parched of thirst and unable to quench it. Too long I've been starving to death and haven't died. I feel nothing. Not the wind on my face, nor the spray of the sea, nor the warmth of a woman's flesh. You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner. You're in one.
His legal case is therefore constructed emotionally, not factually, given the implicit narrative. And that emotion is property of the great story that underlines this narrative, which intertextually builds Assange's legal case. As Yanis Gabriel puts it in his book, Myths, Stories, and Organizations, there are no harbors where we can anchor our systems of meaning. The Flying Dutchman is the expression of a collective imagination that is trying to cope with, and to compensate for the pathnogenic features of the processes of rationalization and modernization. It is a story of a modern man lost in a digital world, without roots, without tradition. Why wasn't it enough for WikiLeaks to publish data and make the truth about manipulation that takes place behind the scenes transparent and accessible? It was not enough because the frames of reference is more powerful than the facts, because the context in which it finds itself gives it meaning. In other words, because the impact of a fact is only as powerful as its framing. And surely, there are many stories woven into the invisible seams of our consciousness. But the question is, can we really end our affair with fantasy? Or should we even? Is there a place beyond the matrix? Can we abandon this media dreamland? Or can it serve us as the way to digital individuation?
No, thank you, but I just wanted to ask you which way I ought to go.
Well, that depends on where you want to get to.
Oh, it really doesn't matter. As long as I can...
Then it really doesn't matter which way you go.
Bum bum bum. Ba-da-da-da. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Anyway, hope you like it.